Good morning. It's Friday, everybody, December 6th. This is Wake Up with KERA News, and I'm Andrew Garcia. We've got clouds rolling in as we head into the weekend. There's a good chance for showers and thunderstorms throughout the weekend, with temperatures hovering in the 40s and 50s or so. A new book looks at the history of the Fort Worth narcotic farm and the history of drug treatment in the American West. We'll hear from the author. That's after today's news. Attorneys for two Southlake families are demanding the U.S. Education Department release the findings of its civil rights investigation into Carroll ISD. The complaints, dating back to 2021, allege students were subjected to racial slurs, sexist remarks, and physical attacks. The investigation wrapped up last September, but investigators haven't released their findings. Carroll ISD says its own review found no wrongdoing. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick says one of his priorities for the upcoming legislative session is a statewide ban on all consumable THC products. Drug policy experts say shutting down the market will be next to impossible. They expect significant pushback from veterans and those who rely on THC products through the state's compassionate use program. Fort Worth was once home to a 20th century experiment in addiction treatment, the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm. When the farm opened in 1938, it was one of two federally funded drug treatment centers in the country. The goal was to offer a less punitive environment for people struggling with addiction. Patients tended to livestock and grew vegetables as a kind of moral therapy. But the narcotic farm was still a prison for the ballooning number of people going to jail for drug crimes after new laws turned drugs like cocaine from over-the-counter remedies into contraband. Oklahoma State University professor Holly Caribou wrote about the history of the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm in her new book, Rehab on the Range. She sat down with KERA's Miranda Suarez.
Who gets sent to the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm, and what was day-to-day life there actually like?
On the one hand, you had people who could voluntarily sign themselves in who wanted treatment for addiction. And on the other hand, you had people who were transferred from places like Leavenworth in particular as part of their federal charges. So you could be sent to the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm instead of a standard prison if it seemed like, you were redeemable or could be treated. And so it was kind of seen as an alternative. So you had this real mixed population, which could create some tensions within the facility itself. People had real different motivations and reasons for being there.
One of my favorite parts of the book was when you start drawing from the patient newsletter, where people were pretty honest about how they felt about being there. So I wanted to ask you how patients themselves and the records we do have, how they felt about the narcotic farm and if it helped them at all.
Well, it's sort of a mixed bag, as you can imagine, right? Some people, it really probably literally saved their lives, the time that they ended up there. When you get to the patient newsletters, there's a whole range of responses, right? One saying, we just want them to close the place down. Another one saying, what I like best are the nurses. It's sort of talking about the gender dynamics that emerged. One of the things that happens, I think, that ultimately undermines the therapeutic value is by the late 1950s, there were longer mandatory minimum sentences passed at the federal level. And so rather than staying 6 months, which was sort of the ideal time envisioned, people are staying 4, 5, 6 years. And that ultimately then undermines their willingness to at all participate in the therapy program when this is just another form of incarceration for them.
And what kind of led to the downfall of the Fort Worth Narcotic Farm? Can you trace for me the decision finally, I believe in the 70s, to shut it down?
This institution very much represented kind of the mid-century faith in centralized bureaucracy and the role of the expert. And by the 1960s, people were really pushing back against that in terms of mental health institutions. And this idea was that addicts should be treated in their own communities, not segregated out to this large, centralized institution. And there was real pushback in Texas against closing the facility because people knew if you close this down, the odds that we're actually going to get funding to replace it are probably slim. Promises and follow through in the federal government aren't always the same, but ultimately they lost that battle and it was transferred to the Bureau of Prisons, where it served as basically a minimum security medical facility, in which it remains today.
What are the parallels, kind of, when we talk about the narcotic farm 50 years on after Fort Worth's closure to today, talking about drugs in the United States? What parallels do you see between those two things?
So many of the debates that they were having in the 1920s are happening in the 2020s, and this question about, do you punish people for drug use, for example? The demonization of, for example, Mexico as the source of our drug problem, rather than seeing it as a demand side, we see it as a supply side problem in many cases. It's easier to kind of blame your neighbor than it is to take a look at why it is Americans need so many drugs, frankly. So that's part of the conversation. This idea that addicts are just irredeemable and not worthy of treatment, I think still in public discussions is sort of part of that. And so that's not to say we don't understand more about addiction, and we put more energy into understanding it, I think, certainly than we did 50 years ago. But we certainly haven't solved the problem.
That was KERA's Miranda Suarez speaking with Professor Holly Caribou of Oklahoma State University. The College Football Conference Championship games kick off this weekend, and one high-profile game on the mind of North Texans is SMU taking on Clemson for the ACC title in Charlotte, North Carolina. Both the Mustangs and Tigers are nationally ranked teams, and if SMU wins, they'll secure a spot in the 12-team college football playoffs. The Stars play the Las Vegas Golden Knights this evening, and they'll take on the Calgary Flames at home on Sunday. There are plenty of holiday activities to enjoy this weekend, including Dallas's annual holiday parade. Enjoy floats, marching bands, and hot cocoa on the streets of downtown. For more information and other fun things to do, visit kera.org/calendar. Thanks so much for listening to Wake Up with KERA News. I'm your host, Andrew Garcia. The show is produced and edited by Shardae White and Bekah Morr. For more news in your inbox, visit kera.org/wakeup. There you can subscribe to the Wake Up with KERA News newsletter, written by Catherine Hobbs. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at KERATX. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.